culture shapes what we do and what we can do in ways that most people find difficult to talk about, difficult to measure with any accuracy. When I was living in Saskatchewan and in constant contact with First Nations people, with Indigenous Canadians, Cree, Ojibwe, some Dene, some other groups, one of the most profound, unexamined assumptions they had was that they would meet up with me later without making any arrangements to get together, And I'm not deluding myself on this. I realize not everyone who meets me really wants to be my friend, but quite a few guys, and they were all guys, not females, all men. There were quite a few guys who met me and were really happy to meet me and really happy to talk to me each time they did bump into me. But, let's say they met me once and talked for half an hour. Then 6 months later, we happened to see each other again. And they would really leave those conversations, happy and say, oh, well, great, I'll see you again soon. And I would be trying to say to them, my dude, you are not going to see me again soon. If you do not write down my email and send me an email and make an arrangement to see me, you are not going to see me ever. And those guys, obviously this isn't true of all First Nations people. It's just an experience I had again and again with those ethnic groups in that area. On a cultural level, they were really used to being in small towns where there was maybe only one pub people would hang out at, or, keeping it all the way real, because of racism, there would only be one pub where First Nations people would hang out at. And boy, goddamn, in Saskatchewan, if you ever get into a taxi and ask to go to a bar that is known as a place where Indigenous people hang out, whoo, the attitude you get from the taxi driver, the racism of the taxi driver is unbelievable. They all know it. The taxi drivers know which bars white people go to and which bars Indigenous people go to, and there's no overlap between the two. So much so that, in different contexts, people absolutely assumed they either assumed I was First Nations or that I was married to a First Nations woman, even if I told them it wasn't so. Because it was so taboo for a white man to just go and hang out in some of those places. Anyway, I had obvious reasons to. I was studying the language, I was studying the politics. But that kind of cultural assumption, oh great, I'll see you later. Dude, this is not a small town, and I don't really live in this town. I'm here as a student, but you are not going to see me later. I want to talk to you. I'm looking forward to seeing you again, too. But you have to actually make an arrangement. And culturally, anyway, those guys, the guys I knew, they never shook it off. Anyway, they themselves joke about some of those cultural differences, and not others. Understandably so. Anyway, for me, I was introduced to Chinese culture not once, but many, many times in my life, starting just growing up in Toronto. Plenty of Chinese folks around in Toronto. But then later, moving to Hong Kong, moving to Taiwan, etc. But, I was reintroduced to Chinese culture, to the real mainland Han Chinese culture, in a remarkable way when I was kicked out of Laos. So the account of this has been written on the internet, but I did leave Laos, the Lao People's Democratic Republic, with death threats from government officials in a very strange political situation. And at that time, unexpectedly, with nothing but my backpack and my bicycle, I really went as a refugee from Laos straight up into Yunnan, China. Actually, I'm simplifying to say straight up. It was a somewhat complicated process of relocating. But anyway, that contrast was just remarkable, because for me, for like 2.5 years, I'd really been living in immersion in the Lao language and the Lao culture and Lao politics, and now I was suddenly confronted with such a different culture, and different in subtle but profound ways. What is work? What is scholarship? what is history? What are our attitudes towards these things? How do they matter to us? What is social status? On these deep, deep levels of cultural assumptions, Chinese culture was profoundly different from Lao culture. And even though I knew that from previously living in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and even living in Toronto, how I felt about it when I went to Yunnan really changed. And I felt, especially in talking to women, that when I went from Laos to Yunnan, I was suddenly surrounded by geniuses. Now, that's not because Chinese women are, inherently much smarter than the women from other countries. But China just went through a unique period of history with the one-child policy, where families were forced to care much more about women's education than they ever had historically in the past. So there are many, many families, they only had one kid. If that kid was a daughter, then even if the parents had chauvinistic, gender-biased attitudes, whatever you want to say, they would be forced to put all their energy and effort into getting that daughter the best education they could, the best preparation for life that they could. Even if the family owned a small shop, they would still be teaching that daughter everything the daughter needed to know to take over that shop. And historically, that was not the case for China. But that was a huge impact of the one-child policy. There were relatively overeducated women all around me. And that's a shocking contrast to Laos, because in Laos, they were just ending a period of history of families having 9 kids and 12 kids. And the government was still encouraging people to have more than 4 kids. The official government policy was to encourage families to be large and have many children. And generally, Lao culture put a much, much lower emphasis on education for anyone. Much lower value on education. And for women, perhaps especially, didn't have that same interest. So that contrast, being kicked out of Laos, finding myself suddenly in Yunnan, China, and finding that part of China, Kunming, Jinghong, and so on, so different from Southeast Asia, but also so different from Hong Kong or Taiwan. In Kunming, I found the level of education among normal people to be much higher than it was in Taipei. I remarked on that many times. When I was in Taipei, I was encountering illiteracy constantly among normal people in the city. Taxi drivers in Taipei who were illiterate. And in Kunming, seemingly even very poor people were illiterate. It was really surprising to me. The attitudes towards history and politics, even though these things are sensitive in China. Every culture has a sort of jagged line between when we're being silly and when we're being serious. And I think one of the things I really appreciate about Chinese culture, although, there's plenty of time to be silly, there's plenty of time to be relaxed, is that they reflect my own values, and that mainland Chinese people will switch into treating things seriously. Like, okay, now we're going to talk about history. Now we're going to talk about politics. This is not a game. They treat that seriously. And by contrast, it can be very frustrating for me with the British, but even with Americans. I've had many negative experiences with Americans where they want to treat what I consider deadly serious matters of history and politics with a very flippant and childish and insulting attitude. Americans, Australians, the British. And again, it's fine to be joking around some of the time. But now when the conversation turns to millions of people dying in the history of Cambodia or, whatever, the Holocaust, any of these things, I really want to be around people who know how to treat those topics seriously. And I have found that with the Chinese, people who are culturally Chinese at every level of education. I'm not just talking about professors in the universities. I did spend a lot of time talking to people with PhDs and professors. But I talked to guys who were ex-military, with no formal education, or they were only educated inside the military. I had one friend there, memorably, who was an electrician, an emergency electrician, so only education being in electrical engineering. So that quality, again, it's on a broad, unexamined level of cultural values. That I really appreciate about China. And, here in Victoria, the only people really willing to talk to me are Chinese, even though I'm living in Canada, which is bizarre. Just a few days ago, in a bookstore, I was looking at books in Chinese, and I started talking to a Chinese woman, a middle-aged Chinese woman who was there in the same section. And, she did something that, again, Chinese people often do with me. At first, she looked at me and was kind of trying to establish, like, are you just a ruffian? Are you a person not to be taken seriously? And I presented her with my business card and told her a little bit about my background. And then that switch happens where she's taking me seriously, talking to me as a scholar or talking to me as an historian. And we stood there, and I think we had a 30-minute conversation about history and politics in that bookstore. Complete stranger, and she's not a traditional academic. She's not a university professor or something. I had a better conversation with her, a random Chinese person in a bookstore, than I have had with any white person at my university. I mean, like any white student or like white normal citizen. I guess I have a couple of white professors who I've had meaningful conversations with, so I got to make something there. But the contrast is amazing. And again, it's not that Chinese people are smarter than other people. It really is just on a deep level of cultural values, where the category of history, politics, the type of scholarship I happen to care about, they also culturally take seriously and care about. I had more friends in Kunming than I ever had in Toronto. And when I was living in Kunming in the past, I couldn't speak Chinese at all. I could count to 10. I could buy things. I was communicating in English 99% of the time. But nevertheless, I had friends there who valued who I was and what I had contributed, even though, put it this way, when I was in China, I met Chinese people who really took seriously and valued like what I knew about Cambodia more than people in Cambodia did. Whether it was Cambodia, Laos, Buddhism, politics elsewhere, just that sensitivity towards history itself. For me, it means a lot. And again, it's not false humility. I'm showing up in all these places. I have no PhD. My formal credentials, you guys already know. I studied political science at university. I'm now getting a second diploma in Asian studies. But, these are people who, skeptically respond to who I am and what I know, and yet they have that capacity to say, okay, this guy is an intellectual, or this guy is a scholar in some sense, and, they're going to relate to me in that way. Now, there are terrible things about China. I guess, to just name one cultural aspect to counterpose to that, one of the scary aspects of Chinese culture is what I call the money now aspect. There are a lot of people in China who talk to you, and they're only interested in money today, and they're not interested in anything for the future or long-term cooperation, what have you. They're interested in what money you can put on the table right now with no long-term foresight. And those are the people who are going to judge you just on how expensive your clothing is, whether or not you're wearing expensive jewelry. They want to know your social class today. They want to cut a deal now. And even though that may sound absurd, you can meet people with that attitude inside a university, inside a language research institute, inside an archive, because I was going to all these inside museums, I was going to all these institutions where there really is no money, or there's very little money, very little opportunity to make money. But when you meet those people who are motivated by money, it is true in Chinese culture that is much more overt and direct and nasty than it is in British culture, by contrast, where that's very much concealed. The British never want to admit to you that something is about money. But I tell you what, I can take it. The rough and tumble aspects of Chinese culture, they don't bother me. Ultimately, we all have different advantages and disadvantages in life in dealing with those situations. But, these things I've said I value, the real contrast is just to the ecological devastation that's around you at all times. The tragedy of China in 2016 is you can't breathe the air, you can't drink the water. Most of the food is not really safe to eat. Contagious disease is terrifying. The hospital system is terrifying if you get sick, if you need help. There are many things about China I am not looking forward to coping with. But, that sense of gravity, that sense of seriousness, and the level of education as a side effect of the one-child policy or whatever it is, that's tremendously valuable to me and tremendously meaningful to me. And whenever I deal with the Chinese, I feel a sense of hope for the future that, tragically, I never feel in dealing with white Canadians, white English-speaking Canadians. I don't feel that at all. I remember sitting down at the table with a scholar who was specialized in Tibet, and because she was a specialist in Tibet, she kept saying really nasty things about China and the Chinese. And I remember, I let her speak for a while, but then I interrupted her at one point when she was saying something basically racist against the Chinese. I said, look, you're saying a lot of stuff against China, but I'm going to tell you one thing right now that, for me, carries more weight than all the things you've complained about. And, she was listening. She said, oh, yeah. The Chinese read books. The Chinese read books and they care about history. And for that reason alone, whenever I deal with China and the Chinese, despite all the terrible problems of their history, all the problems of ecology, all the problems in that economy and that culture, I have hope for the future.